from last week with the Berlin Chronicle. Tyus, have you posted your notes? We're in the process. Okay,
right now,
right,
yeah.
great. All right, so let's look at the syllabus and where we are now, where we're coming from last week, and where we'll be going next week. So we're in the midst of the first sort of segment of the course, which has a lengthy title, Destruction of Experience, Consumption of Time, Proust and Benjamin's Autobiography. Okay, that's a mouthful. So we'll get to Benjamin's autobiographical essay, A Berlin Chronicle, that we have left over from last week. We'll talk about that first today. And then we're going to go into Benjamin's Image of Proust, and along the way we'll talk about Bergson. We'll talk about this category of the image that Benjamin has, that he gets from both Bergson and from Proust. Next week, we'll round out this section of the course with the main reading will be Karl Kraus by Benjamin, the essay on Karl Kraus. That's the long essay for next week. The one-way street selections are also kind of lengthy. We'll discuss some of those. And the destructive character is a short piece. So we have a few little short pieces and reflections. The destructive character is one of them that will be informing us along the way. And then Experience in Poverty, which is not in either Illuminations or Reflections. It's in the selected writings. It's PDF on Canvas. And we'll go over that in detail in class itself, because that's going to be very important kind of thesis statement of Benjamin's. And then I've got like just a handful of little epigrammatic aphorisms by Karl Kraus to help us round out the things that Benjamin quotes in his essay. So he'll be quoting a lot from Kraus, and that will give us a sense of Kraus, but then I've provided some more examples. And Karl Kraus is a totally obscure character, right? Kind of big in the German-speaking world, but in the English-speaking world, not so much. He's probably only famous in the English-speaking world because of Benjamin and Adorno and other people writing about him. Anyway, so any volunteers for next week for presenting on character of destruction? Can I get a second?
Everyone has to do two, correct?
Yeah.
But first we go through everything.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't have to be exactly like that, but yes, generally. So the Kraus essay is divided into three sections: Cosmic Man, Demon, Monster. Does that excite anyone?
Yeah.
Rex, I know you want to. No.
I had a question too.
Yeah, go ahead.
In the syllabus, since we're talking about the syllabus, it said that there's a few papers. I was wondering about like the timing.
There's one out of three.
Okay.
Yeah, one out of three. There are three general topics that correspond to the sections of the course, but just one paper at the end. And so you'll see on Canvas that there are three prompts.
Okay.
And so choose one of those, or a fourth option would be a thesis completely of your own choosing. Do I have a second volunteer? Did I conscript? Oh, okay, great. Okay, Sylvan. Sylvan, you guys. Okay, great. All right, so let's catch up because we did talk a great deal last week about Kant and Freud and Benjamin's sort of pre-Marxian self. However, Berlin Chronicle is solidly within Benjamin's Marxist phase. Now, I want to just make brief mention of timescale. So Berlin Chronicle, there are several different versions of this. Another title, an alternate title of this piece is A Berlin Childhood circa 1900. Right, so Benjamin was born in 1892, and so he would have been 8 years old in 1900. I think that we talked a bit. Did we do any dates, timeline? We did a little bit. So we're focused, therefore, on this latter period that we've discussed. Right, the period between the Franco-Prussian War and World War I. Okay. So this is the period of the Second Industrial Revolution. Of which Germany is the central country. So the main countries of the Second Industrial Revolution are the US, Germany, Japan, also Russia and Italy. And obviously these are your major countries in World War I. The rise of these countries is what causes World War I and then World War II as well. It's Wilhelmine, Germany. So, like it's Kaiser Wilhelm. And he is inheriting the Prussian Empire that was consolidated by Bismarck. Unified the Prussian Empire at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. So at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, the Germans occupy France, they defeat France, and they crown the Kaiser, the Emperor of Germany, in Versailles as a kind of declaration of victory over the French. It's kind of a reverse Napoleon, like revenge for Napoleon. Napoleon, who was defeated first in 1814 and then in 1815. So there is a period of time, Pax Britannica, 1814 to 1914. Right, so when Napoleon is defeated at Waterloo, who is he defeated by? Duke of Wellington, British. Where's Waterloo? Belgium? Yeah. Right. So there is this kind of European system in place after the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon tries to return and break out. He's got 100 days in 1815. Doesn't last long. Okay, so then he's sent to some conversations. So first he's in, I think he's in the Mediterranean, and then he's sent to like the South Atlantic, so completely inescapable place. Okay, so Bismarck is sort of in Prussian Empire, Prussianism. It's sort of notoriously authoritarian, right? Kaiser Wilhelm, however, Kaiser Wilhelm II. This is a period of liberalization. So it's an absolutist monarchy. It is an autocratic state. However, there is a Reichstag. You know what's called the Bundestag? The Reichstag. But it's sort of consultatory parliament. It's not, doesn't really have real power. It just has to approve budgets for the government. That's its main power. And Bismarck had, so the Second Industrial Revolution is also the period of Marxism as a mass movement. And it's also the period of, coincidentally enough, the Second International, or the Socialist International. And the party in Germany, the SPD, There was, just briefly now, recently, the ruling party in Germany is one of the two main parties in Germany today. It's no longer Marxist. It officially renounced Marxism in the 1950s, but it was the central Marxist party in the world. And Bismarck had a deep repressive policy for the socialists. He also had a repressive policy towards the Catholics. So it's an officially Lutheran Protestant state. And the culture Kampf, the culture war. That's where we get the term from, culture Kampf. Culture war between the Protestants and the Catholics in Germany under Bismarck. But Kaiser Wilhelm II tamped down the culture Kampf and also lifted the ban on the socialists. The socialists were an underground party, but then Kaiser Wilhelm lifted the ban on the socialists, so he's a liberalizer. There's the period of rapid industrialization. Berlin is the capital of the Prussian monarchy and the Prussian state and the Prussian Empire, therefore. However, it was a kind of provincial backwater. Prussia is generally the more backward part of Germany, as opposed to Western Germany, the Rhineland, which would have been more bourgeois developed. And in the first industrial revolution, the defensive industry in the Rhineland, that's where Marx and Engels are from. Prussia's eastern Germany, it's the Junkerism, which means a kind of arbitrary feudalistic, the sort of Junkers are the kind of feudalistic landlords. They converted their titles into landlorddom. And also it's part of Poland. So Prussia also is part of Poland. So Poland is not an independent country. So it's part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, part of the Prussian Empire, and part of the Russian Empire. So when I'm saying that Russia is one of the main countries of the Second Industrial Revolution, it's mostly the Western Russian Empire that's industrialized. So the Polish area for sure, the Baltic states, Finland, Petersburg. So it's not all of Russia, it's the western part of the Russian Empire, which ceases to be the Russian Empire after World War I. It becomes Eastern Europe. Okay, Wilhelmine Germany corresponds to what I mentioned, the Belle Epoque. In France is what it's called, and the Gilded Age is what it's called in the United States, and in the Anglophone world in general, but really the United States. So we're in Chicago. Familiar into Chicago. Chicago and Berlin have very parallel histories. So these were kind of backwater places that rapidly expanded during the Second Industrial Revolution. So Berlin went from being a kind of administrative capital, like some kind of provincial, and so symbolized the more backward part of Germany, but then as a function of the Second Industrial Revolution becomes the center of like modern Germany, modern industrial Germany. And so that's where Benjamin was raised. That's where he grew up, and he is born and raised in the aftermath of this rapid expansion of Germany. Germany would have been, Berlin and Chicago in the late 1800s would be like Shanghai today. Where it'd be like super modern, everything was up to date modern, as opposed to an old city like Chicago is now. Right. So Benjamin was born and raised in kind of cutting edge capitalist city in the world. Nonetheless, ruled by an autocratic regime. So there's this kind of funny disjunction or contradiction between however liberalized Wilhelmine Germany was, nonetheless quite a politically repressive kind of police state. Okay, so I mentioned that the Marxist party, SPD, is the largest party in Germany by 1912. circa 1900, it's getting there. There were actually two kind of major parties in terms of size of support. The SPD and what's called the Center Party, which is the Catholic Party. Right, so the two outsider parties are the biggest parties in the Reichstag, the biggest sort of solid parties in the Reichstag. They represent the kind of people who are sort of officially not kosher. Okay, that brings me to my other point, which is, of course, Benjamin is Jewish, and Germany is a kind of a center of European Judaism. There are, we could say, 2 or 3 centers of European Judaism. One would be Germany, Prussian Empire, the other would be the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then finally the Russian Empire. They all are more or less anti-Semitic officially, but Austro-Hungarian Empire and Prussian Empire less so than the Russian Empire. The period of the Second Industrial Revolution in France, Belle Epoque, what's the major political scandal of the Belle Epoque France, of Third Republic France, after the Franco-Prussian War brings down the Second Empire, Third Republic France? The Dreyfus Affair. It's a big deal. It's also a big deal for socialists in France. The emancipation of the Jews in Europe is a function of the French Revolution. So the aftermath of the French Revolution, you get legal equality for Jews, emancipation. And reactionary Europe, Eastern Europe, they kind of roll it back a little bit, but then they have to sort of accept it nonetheless. So Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russian Empire. Now you know that Freud is from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Freud is also Jewish, Vienna. Right, Vienna remains a kind of an old city. It gets quasi-industrialized. It's modern in certain respects, but it's not like Berlin. Berlin is a different kind of place. Benjamin was not a Marxist until after World War I. Right, we talked about that. He's a neo-Kantian, he's a Nietzschean. This is also the period of Nietzsche. Right, so this is the second industrial revolution era. It is Freud, Nietzsche. These figures are and increasingly influential by the time Benjamin's arriving on the scene as a young man. And Germany, of course, is center of modern physics, modern chemistry, and then modern physics. Right, so theory of relativity, quantum mechanics, chemistry. Chemistry is a major industry in the Second Industrial Revolution, and Germany is central.
Did Benjamin ever meet or read Heidegger?
Heidegger is later.
Yeah, but he
Heidegger's
was
later.
already a professor, but like in the 30s.
Yeah, in the 20s is when
and
they would
Benjamin
have.
did meet Hannah Arendt too, right?
Oh yeah. Well, so Hannah Arendt was a student of Heidegger, who was an acquaintance of Benjamin, and Heidegger really, like, his big splash is Being in Time, and that's 1927.
Yeah.
So that would have been like well into Benjamin's Marxist phase, namely everything after 1923. Heidegger taught elsewhere. He wasn't in Berlin, right? And he wasn't in Frankfurt either. He was in Heidelberg and one other place as a professor. So he would have been obscure up until 1927. So someone like Benjamin. So Benjamin would have been sort of solidly in the neo-Kantian world and in the kind of Freudian world and the Nietzschean world before that. And then in the 20s, before Being in Time was published, Benjamin would have been very much in this kind of hothouse Marxist review. So, yeah, but it's Arendt who thinks that there are parallels between Heidegger and but neither of them thought so. Neither of them thought so. And that, might be her wishful thinking as well. So, where was I going with this? Poor Benjamin.
Chemistry, physics.
Yes, and okay, so his status in like liberal Berlin, but it's the center of this autocratic state, right? There's a funny kind of contradiction going on there. So there's a kind of a subtext or backstory to the Berlin childhood, and especially he's writing in 1933. So he's writing it towards the end of the Weimar Republic and, during the rise of Nazism. We'll see next week the one-way street selections we'll be reading, which we looked at a couple on the first day of class. We looked at To the Planetarium and Fire Alarm, which are from One-Way Street. They're from the period of the financial crash and Great Depression. They're from that era. This is well into that, the Berlin Chronicle is well into that era. And so, how much would have changed between 1900 and 1933? A lot. Right, obviously a lot. World War I. The revolutions, Weimar Republic, rise of fascism, rise of communism, in the 20s also, after in the wake of the Russian Revolution, him becoming a Marxist, just all sorts of things. And obviously the rise of anti-Semitism. The reason that I mention this is that the youth movement that he was part of, and we read the 1913 experience piece, his Nietzschean piece, a lot of the youth movement became more anti-Semitic as a function of World War I. So World War I is very German nationalistic, and that breeds a kind of anti-Semitism because Jews are not seen as really Germans, even though they've been there since the Middle Ages.
Is it weird that he didn't bring that up in Berlin? Especially since he left so late, he's just unaware of all this things?
Well, of course he's, the thing is it's there, we're supposed to sort of know this. In other words, we're not the ideal readers for Benjamin at all, right? So he's writing for his contemporaries. These are historical texts now for us, but he's writing for his contemporaries. He's writing to a German audience. He's writing to a Marxist audience. That's the other thing that we're going to get into today. So the Proust essay is written for Marxists, from Marxist audience, yeah. So he can take a lot for granted. And so then, therefore, we have to pay attention to what kind of intervention he's making through his writing. So the city has a physiognomy. Now, I will also say this because we're reading some things out of order. Later we'll be reading, later in the course, thematically, we'll get to it much later, we'll be reading Benjamin's essay on Surrealism, which was published several years before this. And so he has this idea, for the Surrealists, the most surreal object is the city of Paris itself, right? And so the physiognomy of the city is like the model for the Surrealist image, and then we'll see what relation there is between the Surrealist image and the Proustian image and the Bergsonian image, right? We're going to get very deep today into image. Excuse me, this time, today, so I'm catching up from last week, get into this category of the image and what it means. And this is his attempt at a Proustian piece of his own. So it's different from Proust because it's not fictionalized. It's directly autobiographical, as opposed to Proust, which is autobiographical but fictionalized. And also this is more, Proust has a little bit of philosophy, kind of essayism going on, but this is much more leaning in that direction. So this is leaning more in the direction of a critical theoretical piece. In a way that Proust would have been more kind of just philosophical. So it would have been philosophical fiction, which is, a venerable tradition. There's a lot of novels that have philosophical disquisitions in them, like Melville, Moby Dick, Like there's many novels that have this character, but the difference being that Benjamin's has got not philosophy so much as critical theory going on. In which case he's taking up phenomenally his own experience as a symptom of capitalism. Very directly, in a way that we'll see with Proust, it's more mediated, meaning Proust is not a Marxist, he's not a socialist. Does he care about capitalism per se? No, not terribly much, no. Neither does Bergson. But Benjamin does. Benjamin's centrally concerned with it. So Berlin Chronicle, or Berlin Childhood, circa 1900, dedicated to his own son. What we're talking about here is time and space. So I think that last time we came up against the category of reification. Did we talk about reification last time? Thingification?
Yeah.
We did talk about that. Because we were talking about Kant and subject-object and how the subject and object are unified. And then I said, well, but there's this other way in which they're unified in capitalism, namely reification, where you have a reification, a thingification of the object, but you also have reified subjectivity, where we experience our own subjectivity as thing-like. Right, and this is Lukács, so why? Because Benjamin was converted to Marxism by Lukács. I mean, this is like really central to Benjamin's whole intellectual apparatus, is Lukács' Marxism and Lukács' category of reification. So now we're getting into it. So we talked about it's a precondition to be a subject to have notions of space and time, meaning our subjectivity only makes sense to us through our notions of space and time. Now, what we're going to get into today with Bergson, and why Bergson is a vitalist philosopher, and you should always be careful about these history of philosophy kind of categories, because they're very distorting and misrepresenting. It's best to ignore them, but the kernel of truth, because Nietzsche's a vitalist, and maybe Freud's a vitalist, and Bergson's a vitalist. Vitalism seems to be the thing of the late 19th, early 20th century. It seems to be the kind of the Geist, the zeitgeist of the time, but there's some distortion here. That space and time are categories of action, meaning they're projections of action. So I think when we're talking about Kant's whole philosophy is a kind of dialectic of theory and practice, the dialectic of understanding and reason, right? And subject and object are active practical categories, meaning an object is a practical object before it's a theoretical object. The subject is a practical subject before it's a theoretical subject. So the primacy of praxis is a very bourgeois kind of idea. It comes from Rousseau and others like Locke. So space and time are projections of action. This is going to be, again, we're introducing today image and action. Action and image. What's the relationship between image and action? We tend to think of them as opposites. We tend to think of image as like fixed and action as in motion. What would it mean to use Bergson's language, to treat perception as an interaction of images? Perception is an interaction of images. Bah. So that screws with all of our notions of perception, of action, of images, everything. Right? Perception is an activity. So we're not like passive photographic plates on which we receive sensory data. Perception is active. So space and time as projections of action, meaning our notions of space and time derive from our activity. So it's through our activity, through our actions, that we project space and time. And therefore, when we have subjective notions of space and time, where are they deriving from? They're deriving from our practical action. metaphysics, space, time, they don't really exist. We were talking about this today. Bergson had a famous debate with Einstein because Bergson was the most popular philosopher in the world, and Einstein, of course, is this famous, genius physicist. And Einstein said, what you philosophers call time, we physicists know doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. That's a bizarre kind of a statement. Obviously, time exists, but where does it exist? It exists subjectively. And how does it exist subjectively? Practically. Okay, so, but to treat it as if it existed would be a kind of a reification. Right? To treat space and time as external categories. In other words, not deriving from our subjective, practical action, and therefore our subjectivity and our experience. Right? So remember the central category for Kant, experience. How do we account for experience? That he didn't think Humean sense data perception empiricism can account for experience. Right? Experience which is transformative, right, changes us, and therefore has an active character. Right, so the transcendental subject is the subject that transcends and develops through particular moments of sense data perception, and that unifies all those moments of sense data perception. It accumulates, culminates the unity of apperception. And the reason we can change our concepts and our theories is because through our experience, we can change our practices, because our practical action can change, our notions, our concepts, our understanding, our theory can change. So when dealing with these metaphysical categories of space and time, what we're dealing with is very general categories. So all humans ever, right? All cultures, all communities, all, to put it in bourgeois terms, all cooperative communities, all people interacting together, all people acting together, have always had notions of space and time. However, those notions of space and time have changed insofar as the nature of the interaction among the people has changed. So as their collective practices changed, their notions of space and time changed. And of course, capitalism is a major practical change in the way we live together and cooperate, and in the community we constitute. Therefore, it has its own peculiar experience, and therefore theory, of space and time. So, for Lukács, reification is the alienated subjectivity. It's the alienation of our practical action in capitalism. That's what capitalism means. It means alienated social relations. We'll get to that later. And what that means is that we're living in a kind of alienated experience of space and time. There's a kind of disjunction between what seems to be objective about space and time and what seems to be subjective about space and time. Maybe a contradiction even between what seems objective about space and time versus what seems subjective about space and time. And that debate between the philosopher and the physicist would be an example of this cleaving of subject and object, where the physicist is dealing with objective and the philosopher is dealing with subjective phenomena. Right, so what does it mean to live in a world where to be a subject, you can't do without notions of space and time, but theoretical physics is telling you that space and time don't exist? Wow, like that is a perfect example of the tripped out character of capitalism, or alienation. So I mentioned Surrealism, the Surrealist city, the city as the ultimate Surrealist object. Starts with Baudelaire, this idea, and then developed by the Surrealists. And Proust is, we will get into how he's influenced by Baudelaire. Proust is a kind of a proto-surrealist, but he's not yet a surrealist. Benjamin writing in a Proustian style after he's had a very deep engagement with surrealism. So the physiognomy of the city. What he says is that as a child, he would get lost in the city. So he had a bad sense of direction. Berlin's not a grid. It's not like Chicago, it's not a grid. So it's easier to get lost. It's sprawling, it's big, and it has multiple centers. It's a little bit different from like the Loop and like the neighborhoods, like the way Chicago's laid out, or the way New York is with downtown Manhattan. Paris and Berlin are more similar this way, although Paris is a kind of a hybrid example. It's kind of quasi-grid, quasi-medieval, weird streets. Right, and we'll get into that when we get into the Arcades project and the remaking of Paris in the period before the Second Industrial Revolution, the period of the Second Empire is when Paris is rebuilt by the Second Empire. With the boulevards, etc. So Benjamin had a personal experience that he extrapolates into a kind of historical significance. Namely, his experience of the city and being forced to wander and explore the city and end up places that he didn't intend to go. Right, so what he introduces is starting to introduce something that's going to be very important for us throughout the course, which is how we understand time, and then we'll see how it relates to space. So, one way of thinking about time is as linear. However, there's another way of thinking about time, which is cyclical. So, occupying time, inhabiting time, living through time, it has the character of moving along a line, but it also has a character of a recursive movement of return. So the linear notion of time gives us a notion of progress. Cyclical time gives us a notion of the repetition, maybe permanence, yes, permanence, but repetition, recurrence, a kind of recursive, and return. Now, interestingly, all people ever, all communities, have not only had notions of space and time, but they've also had both a progressive, linear, and a repetitive, cyclical notion of time. So the real question is how these are related. How do we relate the cyclical with the linear? Okay, now, space. So I mentioned Lukács, the theory of reification. One of the ways that Lukács described reification as a function of capitalism is that time annihilates space. Time annihilates space, so there's a temporalization of space. relation of space. But there's also the spatialization of time. Right, so we not only have the relationship of the linear and the cyclical as far as time is concerned, but we also have to think about the relation of time and space. And what it would mean to say that in capitalism, and reification, you have a temporalization of space and a spatialization of time. So if the temporalization of space is the annihilation of space, then the spatialization of time would be a kind of fixing or freezing or congealing of time. Now, where does this come from? Marx. Marx, the commodity is congealed time. Commodity is congealed time. That's the model for Lukács's theory of reification. It's the commodity is congealed time. Congealed or crystallized, he also uses the term crystallized. So what we have is social processes as practical temporal phenomena that take the form of things. Take the form of objects, take the form of things, where their social value is a function of the value of time. But more than that, it's a function of the crisis of the value of time. So this crystallization or congealing of time is actually the crisis of like self-contradiction and crisis of time. We'll get there. So the value of time. All right. So phenomenally, how does this manifest? How is this experienced? Right. It's experienced in terms of time becoming an image. Time becoming an image. So if you look at the physiognomy or the architecture of a city, what are you looking at? You're looking at a kind of objectified historical time. You're seeing the accumulated practices over historical time. But also these are things that function by virtue of time. Like, why do we have skyscrapers? We want to maximize the value of time. We want to save time, right? We don't want to have people marching all over space to get from place to place. At a work site, we want them to all just be in one building where they can traverse time very quickly. We also want to maximize the amount of like income that can be gotten out of space, right? So if you have, what do we have, 16 floors in this building, right? 16 floors instead of 1 or 2 floors, then you can get 16 or 8 times the revenue, the rent revenue, the tax revenue, right? And what does that derive from? The value of the activity in that space. Right. There were no skyscrapers before capitalism. Why? There were cathedrals, but not skyscrapers.
But also space, because you have to maximize space in capitalism.
Yeah, it's like a kind of, right, we want to, but it's a peculiar kind of way of rendering space efficient. You know, it's, and also rendering time efficient. It's peculiar. We've naturalized it. It just seems to make sense to us. Because of course, if it didn't, we wouldn't do it. If it didn't make sense, we wouldn't do it. But it's peculiar. And so we have to think about why it wasn't always this way. And that allows us to think of how it won't necessarily in the future always be this way. Because guess what? Marx has said in Socialism, after capitalism, we won't have like these kind of monstrous cities with skyscrapers. We'll have a different relationship between town and country. And they saw the city itself, its physical form, as a pathology of capitalism that would be done away with. Right? Humans wouldn't occupy space so pathologically.
Can you say more about the annihilation of space? I'm not sure I understand it.
Well, what it means is, so I live in a building. I'll use this as an example. I live in a high-rise apartment building. And it was built in the 70s, and it was designed, engineering-wise, the materials to last 40 or 50 years. But now it's more than that. And so it's showing its age, and there is a question of whether it's meant to be, or whether it's meant to be torn down, and whatever, right? So back in the 70s, when they built the building, they were pretty optimistic about the economic situation of the city and real estate and, you know, affordability of whatever. So they just, you build it up, you tear it down, you rebuild. They just thought that would just be this endless process. They wouldn't think that we'd be clinging to like the last shred of value of a decrepit, crumbling concrete skyscraper, which is what it is. It's a condo building, so it's worth a lot. And yet, it's becoming very expensive to keep up. Literally, right? And so, right, in one sense, right, you know, all that is solid melts into air, the Marx Communist Manifesto, like that shit should have been vaporized a long time ago, right? Have you ever seen the demolition of a skyscraper? It's vaporized. Just collapses in a cloud of dust. And it's gone. Right? And that would be, right? But in order to, you know, create something else. Okay, so what's meant here, though, about annihilation of space? It's something that we'll read when we read Kafka. Kafka will say, it's called The Next Village, it's a parable. He said, there isn't enough time in a life to go from one village to another. Now, of course, that's not literally true, so what did he mean by that? Right? What he meant was, if you move from one village to another, it's like a different life, or, you know, you don't ever really leave your home village. Like, it's like this kind of weird modernity, pre-modernity kind of thing. So, the point of this is to say, our experience of concrete space is thrown into crisis by abstract time. Right, so that would be, because these are more of Marx's terms. Right, so we'll get there. So he's looking at the concrete space that he grew up in, Benjamin, Berlin. And as a function of history, he's born in the midst of it, but he's born after a lot of history has already taken place. And he's born in a kind of lead up to a catastrophic outcome of this history, meaning what did the rapid industrialization of Germany lead to? It led directly to World War I. Right, so while they were producing this like massive city and skyscrapers and all sorts of nifty things, really what they were doing is setting the conditions for World War I to happen. Right, so there's a kind of a menace, kind of a foreboding kind of menace to this idyllic childhood of Benjamin's. How is this like Proust? because Proust is also describing how he kind of grew up in one world and then lived as an adult in another world, and how he grew up in this kind of environment that held him like a womb, but then he sort of dislocated as an adult. Right, so Benjamin is saying, I've had that experience too, even though he's a younger generation than Proust. But Proust's experience in France foreshadowed what was going to happen in Germany, because France was the first industrial revolution country, and Germany is the second industrial revolution country. And so Proust, which he translated Benjamin into German, was current in Germany in a way that it had previously been current in France. And so the question is this an exercise of nostalgia? Is Proust nostalgic for his childhood? Is Benjamin nostalgic for his childhood? Not exactly, because after all, they both know that their childhood is going to lead to a more problematic future. So in Proust's case, it's being a child of a wealthy Jewish family in aristocratic and French kind of Gentile bourgeois circles, and then arriving, as a young man, a young adult in the world of the Dreyfus Affair. The Dreyfus Affair, which was an anti-Semitic panic that came in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War, where the idea is that Dreyfus was an officer in the French military who was accused of betraying the French to the Germans, which contributed to the German victory in the Franco-Prussian War. But it was not true. But the idea is that the Jews are the enemies in our midst, right? They're not loyal to the nation. And something similar happens, of course, in Germany later. So it happened in France, and then it happens in Germany. Right, and it happens in Germany in a much more horrific form, but it was pretty horrific in France too. They almost had a civil war over the Dreyfus Affair. It almost broke out into a civil war in Third Republic France. So it's a major political controversy of Third Republic France, so the period between 1871 and 1914. The major political crisis in France was the Dreyfus Affair. Which Proust was not prepared for by his childhood, and yet he also sees evidence of it in his childhood. He kind of finds like a kind of foreshadowing of it in his childhood. Benjamin's doing something similar here with a different case of Berlin instead of provincial France and then Paris. It's Berlin. All right, so coming back around to it though, temporalization of space, spatialization of time. The image that Benjamin uses that's going to be pertinent for us with Proust and Bergson, the labyrinth. So how do we understand like a labyrinth form, right? Right, it has a kind of recursive but linear quality. So in traversing a labyrinth, it is a line folded back on itself. So it's a line folded back on itself. And the joy of the labyrinth is that it's some place that you go, the pleasure of it is that you enter the labyrinth to get lost and then to find your way out of. Right? So you get lost in it, and then you get disoriented by it, and then you figure it out and you leave the labyrinth. So it's a peculiar relationship between the experience of time and space, where when you're in the labyrinth, it's really just a matter of turns and kind of a path. Whereas if you look at it from above, it has a very different character than if you're in it. So the idea here is that looking back on his childhood, looking back on his history, what he says is that he has this fantasy that he could map out his childhood. and that the map of his childhood would be the map of the city of Berlin. All right, so on the one hand, he traversed that time linearly, but then the fantasy is to represent it spatially. And that in looking at the map of the city, it would tell him about things that were unique events, things that were repeated occurrences, and it would tell him how he lost himself and found himself in this space over time, over a period of time. All right, so that the fantasy of mapping out one's life and having the map of one's life be a concrete space, namely a city. Right, and again, that is like a surrealist kind of phenomenon. And surrealist meaning not other than real, but an intensified reality. Right, but that's the effect that he imagines that this would have, is that it would sort of condense his childhood and intensify and sort of bring out, glean, distill the essence of his experience.
And also sort of a Kabbalistic notion of like the mind as a space that is pathways that you're like traveling.
Yes, certainly. That's right. Now, if I'm not mistaken, it's also the reading of scripture, the idea that scripture is linear, but then it also has this kind of other dimensions to it, right? That sort of allow the text to sort of make contact with parts of itself out of its linear kind of quality. And that's part of also the point, right? Is that I think he said in the planetarium, the ecstatic trance. So if you know what ecstasy is, not the drug, but the state, right? So to be ecstatic means to be dislocated in time and space, right? To kind of transcend your kind of empirical, concrete time and space. So ecstasy is supposed to put you in touch with a different order of experience that is an ordinary time and space.
He also dislocates us literally in the text. He transports us between Berlin and Paris.
Uh-huh.
Yeah?
Because he's writing from Paris, yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
He's thinking back, so he's left, he's in Paris, he's working on the Arcades project. And again, the Arcades project is about an even earlier period. It's about the history of the 1830s and 40s, and then in the 50s and 60s, the Second Empire. That's right. So this coincidence of these two cities, Berlin and Paris, is important, and his experience of them. So his experience of Berlin as a child, his experience of Paris as an adult. Okay, the city has a map, mapping out one's life, mapping out one's childhood. There's another image that I feel like I'm forgetting. Like the labyrinth we've got. Because now I'm confusing this text and the what we read for this week about the folding and the unfolding, the two kinds of unfolding. No? Okay. All right, but you guys had notes on this, if I recall, right? So, from on the Berlin childhood. So let's look at just briefly to see if I'm leaving anything out. Oh yeah, that's right. You guys had your let's see. Yes.
I did have a question. You
Go
said
ahead.
like the thing was really ominous. Was that something that people, because I know he's writing in retrospect, is that something that people were keyed into at the time, or was it like the Roaring '20s, so to speak. Like they're not seeing this
menace?
disaster coming.
No, it's the Roaring '20s. Weimar Republic is definitely like that. There's a film. Why am I forgetting the filmmaker's name? The Damned. Is it Conti? The Damned? No? Is that Weimar? Let me see if I can find this. No, we don't want that one. We want the classic film. Yes. This is by Visconti. Lucio Visconti. So this is about the end of the Weimar Republic. It's a classic film. You guys should see this film. Of course, you should see this film. It's a little bit of a traumatic film, but you should like see it. He also did, I think Visconti did a film of Death in Venice, if I'm not mistaken. Which is Thomas Mann. I'm not mistaken. Yeah, Death in Venice, yes, indeed. Yeah, anyway. And that's a couple of years after The Damned. But yeah, so it's funny because on the one hand, we'll deal with those in coming weeks, but we could say that there was a trauma, World War I, but then people responded to that trauma with this kind of liberation in the 1920s, the kind of manic, kind of roaring 20s. It's a period of capitalist recovery and growth before the Great Depression, right? The crash in the Great Depression. So, mania, depression. We could say that capitalism has this quality of alternating periods of mania and depression. In fact, both of which are traumatic, right? And both of which are expressions of a trauma. So they kind of are expressions of a trauma and reinforce a trauma. So as he said, I have long indeed for years played with the idea of setting out the sphere of life, bios, graphically on a map. First I envisaged an ordinary map, but now I would incline to a general staff's map of a city center, if such a thing existed. Doubtless it does not, because of ignorance of the theater of future wars. I have evolved a system of signs, and on the gray background of such maps, they would make a colorful show if I clearly marked in the houses of my friends and girlfriends the assembly halls of various collectives, from the debating chambers of the youth movement to the gathering places of the communist youth, the hotel and brothel rooms that I knew for one night, the decisive benches at the Tiergarten, the ways to different schools and the graves that I saw filled, the sites of prestigious cafes, whose long-forgotten names daily crossed our lips, the tennis courts where empty apartment blocks stand today, and the halls emblazoned with gold and stucco that the terrors of dancing classes made almost the equal of gymnasiums. Dancing classes, gymnasiums, or gymnasiums, I guess, not the gymnasium is the high school, I guess gymnasiums. And even without this map, I still have the encouragement provided by an illustrious precursor, the Frenchman Leon Daudet, exemplary at least in the title of his work, which exactly encompasses the best that I might achieve here, Paris Vécu. Lived Berlin does not sound so good, but is as real. And it is not just this title that concerns me here. Paris itself is the fourth in the series of voluntary or involuntary guides that began with my nursemaids. Right, so if I had to put in one word what I owe to Paris for these reflections, it would be caution. I should scarcely be able to abandon myself to the shifting currents of these memories of my earliest city life had not Paris set before me, strictly circumscribed, the two forms in which alone this can legitimately, that is, with the guarantee of permanence, be done. And had I not forsworn the attempt to equal the first as firmly as I hope one day to realize the second, the first form was created in the work of Marcel Proust, and the renunciation of any dalliance with related possibilities could scarcely be more bindingly embodied than in this translation of it that I have produced. Related possibilities, do they really exist? They would certainly permit no dalliance. Where Proust began so playfully, became awesomely serious, he who has once begun to open the fan, okay, the fan of memory, he who has once begun to open the fan of memory never comes to the end of its segments. No image satisfies him, for he has seen that it can be unfolded, and only in its folds does the truth reside. That image, that taste, that touch, for whose sake all this has been unfurled and dissected, and now remembrance advances from small to smallest details, from the smallest to the infinitesimal, while that which it encounters in these microcosms grows ever mightier. Such is the deadly game that Proust began so dilettantishly, in which you will find more successors than he needed companions. Yeah. So, unfolding like a fan, that's like a Japanese fan. Yeah, so the idea that time unfolds, right? It doesn't just stretch out, but it unfolds. Which, again, if we were to think of this progressive linear versus cyclical and repetitive, but also spatialized. Experience. Okay, so let's before we kill all of our time. Time marches on, children. Ay, definitely marches on. It's awful.
It's more in the document by Rex. Yeah.
Rex, okay. All right, let's, right, here we go. So,
There's a reference to his, also, when he's talking about the labyrinth, and he describes his life as like a family trees, too. I think there's one up there. So basically the diagram he lost, but it's devastated.
oh yeah. I interrogated my past life, and the answers were inscribed as if on their own accord on a sheet of paper that I had with me. A year or two later, when I had lost the sheet, I was inconsolable. I have never since been able to restore it. Right. Now, that's another, like the sort of family tree idea is very Proustian, because Proust is all about these lineages and relations and whatnot. Good.
Is also mapping, yeah, but he attempts to do the Berlin chronicle. Yeah, but it's mapping not in space but in time. Yeah, so it also makes this stretch from this time-space conjunction.
We touched on it last week, but yeah, at the end, we're just discussing also the capitalism and society and the mania and depression. We discussed at the end. I think we covered a lot of it.
Let me say something, because we talked about time and space as projections of action, mania and depression. So mania is like involuntary action, and depression is involuntary inaction. In other words, depression is kind of a paralysis, which would seem to be the opposite of like the compulsive action of mania. All right, so in other words, capitalism might oscillate between stasis and compulsive action. And so then where is the subject, right? So the subject is kind of like in neither place or in both places.
Well, Proust, and I was really struck by Benjamin's description of it, like Proust's depression, essentially,
Oh, yeah.
that he was just like drawn by this like he described it, his eyes looked like a gambler or someone in love, and the quote that Rex just pulled of like the feeling of like at one point I had everything written on a piece of paper and it was perfect, but I lost it. And it's like, I don't know, thinking about like mania's action that you can't stop and depression is wanting to have action you can't do, and Proust and Benjamin kind of sitting in between those where it's like they can never be happy, but they obsessively have to unfold the fan even though it will never be what they need it to be. He'll never be able to reconstruct that sheet of paper with all the answers.
Mm-hmm.
Really depressing.
Huh.
But it's also
Really
really
bummed me
manic.
out.
Yeah.
But it's also like really manic that he thought he had all the answers,
Yeah.
because he probably in reality did not have
Did
all
not.
the answers from
Right.
the diagrams.
There's
He had
so many
figured it
different
all out.
spatializations that he imagines of it, like the fan, the map, the maze, like and none of them do it justice.
Right. What's the meme? It's a meme where it's really an image.
It's
like,
a meme, but it's
Yeah, this guy.
Oh, yes.
This guy, like, he's like, I had it all figured out. And you mean, like, I had mapped out my whole life. And then they came and kicked me out of my apartment. Ding. Okay. All right, let's.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Pablo.
I just didn't get the chance to write it. You said capitalism oscillates between stasis and
Compulsion, like compulsive action.
compulsive action.
Yeah,
And the subject
involuntary-
is alienated in between, right?
Right. The subject is kind of lost between those two. Right. Like neither feels like the subject's own like doing, you know? Like
Yeah.
it's involuntary stasis, involuntary action.
It's like a really good description.
Hmm?
It's a good, really good description.
All right. So let's look at the beginning of Benjamin's Proust essay because it gives us all sorts of like thesis statements that are going to be true for everything that we read by Benjamin henceforth. Okay, so the 13 volumes of Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time or Remembrance of Things Past are the result of an unconstruable synthesis in which the absorption of a mystic, the art of a prose writer, the verve of a satirist, the erudition of a scholar, and the self-consciousness of a monomaniac have combined in an autobiographical work. It has rightly been said that all great works of literature found a genre or dissolve one, that they are, in other words, special cases. So that's very important. So every great work of literature, every great work of art founds and dissolves a genre. Right? So for a work of literature or work of art to be great, it has to dissolve its own genre and reestablish it. So what we have here especially is the novel form. So the novel form is being kind of twisted beyond recognition by Proust. And what he has in mind, the novel form, the definition of the novel form that he has in mind is Lukács's, from the theory of the novel, which is the idea of the kind of paradigmatic novel would be the Bildungsroman. So how the protagonist came to be who they are, so their kind of formative experience. So the apprenticeship of Wilhelm Meister by Goethe would be a perfect kind of exemplar of this. And that what defines a novel in terms of when it begins and when it ends is when a kind of transformative action or event or course of events takes place. So the protagonist goes through a kind of transformative process from the beginning to the end of the novel. And in fact, again, it's core to this idea of the Bildungsroman. the reader is supposed to have a transformative experience as a function of reading the novel. In other words, the reader is supposed to go through this process of transformation that the protagonist goes through. This is different from the epic. So the novel is a transformation of the old epic form, which was the dominant form of narrative, because the epic is more episodic, and also it's less about the time and history of the protagonist than it is of the community. So the epic is about the community, the novel is about the individual, and the epic is about how the community came to be what it is, and the novel is about how the individual came to be who they are. Right. So, as I mentioned, for Nietzsche, right? So Nietzsche thinks that like the Old Testament is like a great epic, but the New Testament is a bad novel. Okay, so among these cases of special cases that found a genre or dissolve one, among these cases, this is one of the most unfathomable. Okay. From its structure, which is fiction, autobiography, and commentary in one, to the syntax of endless sentences, the Nile of language, which here overflows and fructifies the regions of truth, everything transcends the norm. The first revealing observation that strikes one is that this great special case of literature at the same time constitutes its greatest achievement of recent decades. So even though it's completely atypical as a novel, it's the greatest achievement of the novel form of recent decades. So again, he's writing a little bit after it's been published, but it's still, so it's in the recent past, so it's not like current, but it's in the recent past. The conditions under which it was created were extremely unhealthy, an unusual malady, extraordinary wealth, and an abnormal disposition. This is not a model life in every respect, but everything about it is exemplary. So exemplary but not a model. Exemplary but not a model. That's really a hard one to quite understand. Because when we think of an example, we think of a model to emulate, to follow. So what would it mean to say exemplary but not a model? It's a pathological case. It's a pathological case. It's an exemplar of a pathology. It's not a model because hopefully we won't all be little Prousts anymore, except we still are because it's 2025 and we're still in capitalism, and it turns out we didn't transcend the Proustian condition the way Benjamin might have thought we were about to. So when he's writing this, he's like, communism, yes, let's do this, people. Marxism, all right, transcending capitalism. And then Proust will be this monument of this pathological form of life, of the way people used to be. Now, what's interesting about exemplary but not a model in another respect is that it's in the particular case. Like, no one else could possibly have had the life that Proust had, and yet it became characteristic of our experience. All right, so the fact that it's completely unusual conditions and yet generalizable in its truth. How bizarre is that? The outstanding literary achievement of our time is assigned a place in the heart of the impossible, at the center and also at the point of indifference of all dangers, and it marks this great realization of a life work as the last for a long time. The image of Proust is the highest physiognomic expression which the irresistibly growing discrepancy between literature and life was to assume. This is the lesson which justifies the attempt to evoke this image. All right, so, like I said, so he's a Marxist writing for other Marxists. So here we go. Why should anyone care about some rich guy and his strange, nostalgic remembrance of his childhood and all of his sort of like, unfulfilled dreams and, like who cares, right? Who cares? Like, what does this have to do with the working class and its struggle for socialism?
Well, it was interesting because he's like, as a child, he's like super neurotic. It reminded me of what we just read about Freud and his family and his neuroses and the whole like, I don't know if that, if, you know, like just his descriptions of his family life as a rich little boy, obviously in this society is relevant, you know, to what.
Seemingly, but again, at first glance, no, right? So here's a point that I think I raised last time. I hope I did. Modernism, realism. Okay. So when Benjamin's writing this, what's happening in the communist world? Socialist realism is being installed as the official style, right? Or the ethos, we might say, of art and literature. So art and literature has to be realist, social realist, socialist realism, social realism. It's got to be about the reality of the working class. Otherwise, it's reactionary, it's decadent, right? So socialist realism as opposed to bourgeois decadence, and modernism is bourgeois decadence. Proust is like the perfect case. Like, this is bourgeois decadence. This is total, 100% bourgeois decadence. And the formal qualities of the work that Benjamin is extolling is an example of that decadence. In other words, it completely destroys the novel form, and yet also preserves the novel form in a bizarre way, in this modernist way, whereas the socialist realist critics would be like, see how the bourgeoisie, they just are losing their minds, they're so wealthy that they're psychotic, and read this if you want a sense of the experience of the decadent bourgeoisie. But this has nothing to do with the experience of the working class, right, which would correspond to a kind of, you know, reasoning and like figuring out reality and, you know, achieving things and, you know, et cetera, right? It wouldn't be this narcissistic guy who's an insomniac, who sleeps during the day and is a maniac up at night, and who is, you know, asthmatic, you know, he's got all sorts of problems, right? Like, this is just not the life of a working class person at all. And so this is like what happens to the decadent bourgeoisie. They become antisocial, recluses, right? They're just living off money, right? They're not even like productive capitalists. Like, the Proust is not an entrepreneur. He's not like Elon Musk. He's not like making things, doing things. He's not. He's just living off inherited wealth and just descending into madness. And of course, then he would write this novel. And of course, the bourgeoisie would celebrate it as a great novel because it's true to their condition. So Benjamin is saying, no, we need to pay attention to this because this is a more generalized condition. And what Proust experienced, and he's going to do this with Baudelaire as well, what Proust experienced a generation earlier is now becoming the more general experience in society. And his peculiar psychology is becoming a more general psychology in the culture. And so it's popular. It's popular. And the socialist realists would have a hard time explaining its popularity, and especially its increasing popularity. You know, it seems to capture something, but also seems to capture like a world that's gone. So again, like, why should we remember a like mid to late 19th century French world and you know, let's say for his German audience in the 1920s in Germany? Why? And you know, again, you could say, well, it's like a portrait of the ruling class. That'd be easy. And in some ways, he makes some rhetorical concessions to that. We'll see. All right, so he's constantly kind of using pejorative language to describe Proust constantly. But it's not just that, right? It's not just, oh, we should pay attention to this because it tells us about the truth of the world because it's a window on the world through the ruling class. Because he's not a typical ruling class person either, Proust. He's not a political person, he's not an entrepreneur, not an industrialist. Okay. We know that in his work, Proust did not describe a life as it actually was, but a life as it was remembered by the one who had lived it. And yet, even this statement is imprecise and far too crude. For the important thing for the remembering author is not what he experienced, but the weaving of his memory, the Penelope work of recollection. One should call it rather a Penelope work of forgetting. Is not the involuntary recollection, Proust's memoir involontaire, much closer to forgetting than what is usually called memory. And is not this work of spontaneous recollection in which remembrance is the woof and forgetting the wharf, a counterpart to Penelope's work rather than its likeness. Counterpart rather than its likeness. For here the day unravels what the night is woven. When we awake each morning, we hold in our hands, usually weakly and loosely, but a few fringes of the tapestry of lived life as loomed for us by forgetting. However, with our purposeful activity and even more our purposive remembering each day unravels the web and the ornaments of forgetting. This is why Proust finally turned his days into nights, devoting all his hours to undisturbed work in his darkened room with artificial illumination, so that none of these intricate arabesques might escape him. Okay, so he's got this idea of weaving and a web. So the difference between weaving and a web is that a web is more of a kind of organic creation of the spider. It's a kind of instinctual behavior, whereas weaving has more of an intentional character. It's a kind of purposive, kind of industrial activity by humans, obviously. So animals don't weave. They might spin webs, but they don't weave. All right, so forgetting and remembering, this is going to be important, that every form of remembering is actually a form of forgetting. So remembering is like literally putting the pieces back together, like remembering. And forgetting is letting go. Right, to forego, to forget, to forego. Right, so it's with grasping and letting go, but grasping as like putting things back together, reconstructing. So remembering is an activity, forgetting is an activity. Proust was inspired by Bergson's Matter and Memory to write the novel. Right, so literally, he's like reading this philosophy and he's like, I'm going to write a novel. This is true to my experience, and I'm going to write a novel that demonstrates this philosophical truth of my experience. So it's a curious kind of attempt to kind of realize a philosophical program, right, through literature. And as such, then, it can serve that double duty of being this kind of autobiography that captures a historical moment, but also captures the kind of philosophical zeitgeist of the moment. You do both of those things at the same time. Now, here I'll bring in, before we take a break, a little bit of the Bergson. So I mentioned one key idea of Bergson, which is that perception is the interaction of images. Another is what he says in the beginning of Matter and Memory, that he's going to try to address something non-dualistic through a frankly dualistic approach. Okay, so what does he mean by that? So matter and memory. So when we think of, like, I don't know, how we hold a memory, we might think our brains hold memories, or computer chips hold memory in a computer, right? So we think of like matter that holds memory, rather than as we should think of it, which is that matter is memory. Right? So he describes matter as extended action over time. So what is matter? Matter is an action that sustains itself over time. So this chair is a chair because it's being a chair, because it's acting like a chair, and it's maintaining that action over time. Right, so this was a piece of plastic and some aluminum and whatnot. It's shaped in order to perform an action. To sit my ass down and hold me up, it holds me up. So it's doing, it's holding me up, preventing me from falling to the floor. Right, so it's acting, and it's maintaining that action. That's what matter is. Matter is extended action in time. Right, so the world around us, all the physical things, all the space, everything, is past action, continuing. Okay, so, but we nonetheless do think of action and matter as opposite things, as different things and opposite things. And similarly, we experience memory as having this quality of like an energy that it would be distinct from matter. Right, so we think matter is memory, memory is matter. Memory is matter. Right, so both would be true, kind of syllogistically. Perception as the interaction of images. What is an image? Right. An image, or excuse me, what is matter? Matter is a collection of images.
I don't get how memories matter. Like, because, like, it's not like, it's not an action that, it's not maintaining any action over time, and memory's actually changing.
Matter's changing too. Right, matter's
Well,
changing
matter's
too.
changing too.
Matter's changing too. Memory is changing because memory is like a past thing that's continuing. So memory is matter in the sense that memory is also action extended over time. Okay, so what does it mean to define matter as a collection of images, or as an accumulation of images, or an agglomeration of images? What is an image? An image is a potential interaction. Meaning, all the various ways I can interact with this chair defines it as matter. So I could not only sit in it, I could, if I was younger and sprier and trained, I could do like avant-garde dance moves. I could do gymnastic stunts using this chair, right? I could do all sorts of things with it. So it would be defined in all the ways that it can be interacted with. That's what would define it as matter. Right? Its properties as matter would be defined in terms of all its potential interactions. So there are simple pieces of matter and complex pieces of matter. Simple pieces of matter have limited interactive capabilities. Complex pieces of matter have complex possibilities of interaction. So this smartphone is a very complex piece of matter because I can do all sorts of things with it by comparison with the chair. I can do many more things with this than I can do with the chair. And that might be why it costs $1,000, whereas the chair costs, I don't know, $50. Because part of that has to do with what's packed into it and its possible use.
Why did he use the word image? It doesn't seem to make, like, that's not, at least in English, image and the idea of potential for action, that doesn't seem like a word that would necessarily imply that. Do you know what the French word he used was, or?
Image.
Yeah, it is image. Yeah. So, I mean, it would have been just as strange for people in French. Yeah, it would have been just as strange. So, I think that what we have to do is separate picture and image. So this is generally true, not just Bergson, but when I teach art history. So when thinking of a painting is a physical object. As a physical object, it's an image. When we look at it, we see a picture. Meaning our minds make out of the physical image a mental picture that isn't actually there. Like the art of painting is making us see things that are not physically there. So that would be a good way of distinguishing between picture and image. So he's not saying matter is a picture. Matter is not a representation. So theories of representation, children, we got to stop. I hate all theories of representation, just stop. And also semiotics, but we'll talk about that later with Benjamin. Semiotics is also bad. Theories of representation, semiotics, this is just the total corrosive solvent that eliminates all reason. It's bad, 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 bad. Because it leads us to think, oh, why does he describe matter as an image? And the first thing that we think of when we think of an image is a representation. No.
He does use the word representation.
Sure.
As well.
But representation in a completely different sense, meaning representation meaning making something present. In other words, it has that active character to it. Whereas our notion of representation is more like a photocopy. It's like a passive reflection. Right? So, no. Reading is an action, listening is an action, looking is an action. Looking at a painting is an activity. So what are we doing? We're making a picture out of an image. We're interacting with a physical object. That's what we're doing. But also as a percept, it's a perceptive, right? So, because literally the eye is an image. The retina is an image. The brain is an image. The optic nerve is an image. The body is an image. Right? All right, so let me demonstrate. Okay, so unicellular organism. Right, we had the unicellular organism last week of the ego. Right, now we have the unicellular organism as like the Bergsonian life form. Okay, so the simplest form of life is the cell. Simplest form of life is the cell. What makes it a form of life? What kind of image that it is? Okay, so literally the physical surface of the cell is the image. So it has like proteins on it, it has like little funny things. And I guess now we're supposed to know about these things in ways that are too unnerving, like the spike protein. And Moderna, I think it's, what's the vaccine that they have for this season? It's called Next Spike or something. And I'm like, I'm definitely not getting that. Fuck that. I'll find something else to get. My ivermectin or some shit. So, no, a non-mRNA. I think there's a different vaccine. It's like a non-mRNA vaccine. Do that one, Jimmy. So, proteins, yes, and then there are things floating in the element where the cell lives. When the proteins connect, when or the electrolytes or what have you connect with the proteins, the cell is both perceiving and interacting with those things. We, because we're multicellular organisms with specialized organs, we have an extended circuit of both perception and action. Right, so we can see things far away that the cell cannot. The cell cannot see things far away from it. It can only see things that it's in contact with physically. Turns out we can also only see things that we're physically in contact with as well, but the physical contact is via light. That's another Marx, by the way. We'll go to it when we read the commodity fetishism passage about the physical relation between the eye and what it sees, which is different from commodities, which have no physical connection. Okay. So why can we see things at a greater distance from the cell being able to perceive things because our capacity for action is much greater. In other words, when the cell has touched it, it's done, meaning it either destroys the cell or nourishes the cell. Whereas we can see a bear coming, and it can destroy us, or we can kill the bear and eat it ourselves, right? So the distance that we can perceive things has to do with the scope of action that we have by comparison with the cell. So he says this greater circuit of perception is also a greater circuit of action, and there's a greater scope of action. Right? So we have more choices than a cell. That's what makes us a more complex form of life than a cell. Like you could say, forms of life are ascending with respect to their possibilities of action and their possibilities of perception that are connected to those possibilities of action. Because after all, we act with the same things that we perceive things, namely our nervous system. And the brain is an image. And you know the, what is it, smooth versus like folded brains, like smooth brain, less intelligence, folded brains. And he's definitely doing that, Bergson, for sure. He's just like, yes, human brain has more folds than another mammal brain, or than a reptilian brain, or than a fish brain, or than an insect brain. And that's because our capacity for action is greater, and our perception is also greater, and including our perception in terms of how we process. So even though other animals have more attuned senses, they can't process the data as complexly as we can.
Yeah, is our capacity for action proportional to our memory too? I mean,
Yes.
memory being experienced,
Yes.
so the more we experience, the more memory we have, so the more memory we have, the more capacity to action.
That's right. So the way Bergson understands memory, in this human sense, rather than in the sense of all matter being memory, but in this human sense, the circuit of perception, the kind of protracted aspect of it, means that we remember things differently than the animals do, right? So we remember things more consciously than the animals do. And the animals remember things more built into their bodies, whereas we remember things more cognitively, consciously. And it turns out we also remember things in our bodies, unfortunately, meaning traumatic events also imprint themselves on our physical selves in ways that we're not fully cognizant of. But he's less concerned with that. So Bergson is not Freudian. He's not. It's interesting that he's a contemporary of Freud, but he doesn't have a conscious-unconscious antagonism in the way that Freud did. He has a different kind of way of thinking about the unconscious and the conscious. Right, so part of the unconscious and the conscious has to do with just the attributes of the form of life. So the unconscious part of ourselves for Bergson would be the more primitive part of ourselves. Right, it would be the reptilian brain as opposed to the mammalian brain. Right, so mammals are more conscious than reptiles, and so our reptilian functions are less. Our autonomic nervous system is the simplest and the oldest and the most unconscious versus the cerebral cortex, which is the most advanced and conscious. Right, so you have that kind of idea. Not like Freud. Right.
Sorry, I have more questions about
Yeah,
this
yeah.
one.
Yeah.
So where is he? I know he's like right in the middle, but where do you see him in terms to closer to like Platonic idealism and the Aristotelian potentiality? Right? I mean, it's like it's like right in the middle. But I think when you say when you tell us all this, I can just imagine that things are in themselves and not like in an ideal realm, right?
Right.
But then they are, so that's more Aristotelic, right? Because
Yeah.
they're like subject to their potency. So
He's a materialist.
okay.
He's a materialist. Like in other words, if we trace idealism and materialism all the way back, Plato would be the idealist and Aristotle would be the materialist. But then that shows just how little sense there is to that distinction between idealism and materialism.
Is he trying to find like a middle path?
He is, between rationalism and realism, right? So that's the language he uses. Bergson, right? So it would be different from Kant in the sense that the rational a priori would be like in our bodies, right? It would be in our physical selves. Which is, another way of thinking about it. But he also thinks that that can be altered. In other words, he knows that we can alter our neurology and our experience. So part of what Bergson is doing is he's trying to give an account of experience that otherwise has eluded philosophy. So in some ways, Bergson is doing exactly what Benjamin said had to be done in the program of becoming philosophy.
A lot of that does remind me, though, of the St. Augustine conception of time and memory, and how it feels like there's kind of a compatibility there with the idea that our experience of time is sort of a function of memory, and how there's like this, I think they just kind of add this like higher subjectivity to it about how memories can be distorted as an understanding of time.
Right, so let's think about that, okay, because that's an important dimension of it, which is that we don't just experience ourselves in the present. We experience ourselves in the present in relation to the past.
And also in the future.
And also in the future, right? In terms of a potential,
Yeah.
right? In terms of like we project our action into the future mentally before we act on it physically. Past, present, future. Let's talk about that.
Because was it that St. Augustine had the idea that there was a distinct past, present, and future, but like a future past, or sorry, present past and a present future?
Yes, so this is actually important because do you know the Drake meme? No. Yeah. Right. So no, it's not past, present, future like that. No. Yes, it is. So the future projects out of the relationship between the present and the past, which is bidirectional. It's not unidirectional. So it's not like past, present, future. It's rather we're constantly inhabiting both the present and the past, and that's what's generating the future. Right, so it's not like the past expires in the present, which then escapes itself into the future. No. So I think that I mentioned that Benjamin, so he's the greatest literary critic of his time, that's his aspiration. He wanted to, but didn't get around to writing about three other great writers. So he wrote about Kafka and Baudelaire and Proust and Brecht and others, but he didn't get a chance to write about James Joyce, William Faulkner. He wanted to write about Faulkner. Big time. And Faulkner has the famous phrase, the past is not dead, it's not even past. The past is not dead, it's not even past. Why? Because the past continues to act in the present. Meaning, we're all projections of the past. Everything around us is a projection of the past. So the past continues. And then our present action is, any action that we take is inevitably an interaction with the past. Right, so the future comes from the combination of present and past action. And change means that the present isn't simply the continuation of the past, but it's potential alteration. So when we act differently in the present, all we're doing is taking past action and changing it. Right, so the past conditions the present, but it's not determinative, and it certainly isn't determinative of the future.
He talks about choice and freedom.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Bergson does care about that, but he also it's a funny way, like what's going on there. So again, the vitalism, he still is in this kind of strange antinomical world of free will and determinacy, right? Where he's just like, well, okay, the scope of action, the freedom of the will is determined by the complexity of matter and the amount of images that matter contains, right? He's trying. He's giving us this language, these categories. But the question is, does he actually solve the problem or not? Right? Because that was also the problem. We went into this week having read Benjamin's On the Program of the Coming Philosophy. The problem Benjamin lays out, certainly Bergson is trying to address, but does he? And then, of course, Proust, in sort of enacting this philosophical program through, literary form, does Proust accomplish, right? Through literature, what Bergson was trying to attempt through philosophy and what Benjamin is saying needs to happen, namely the better account of experience, right? Has that been achieved or not? Or has the problem rather been more specified, the problem been more kind of crystallized, we could say, like come into sharper relief? Right, that's really the issue. All right, let's take a short break, and then we'll come back. Stretch our legs, bathroom break. Let's resume.
My meeting with Joanne.
Let's resume.
Yeah, after that.
So Matthias prompted me to bring up the Bergson, and then we'll turn back to the Benjamin. So let's just look at his introduction and where he kind of plotting himself philosophically. This book affirms the reality of spirit and the reality of matter, and tries to determine the relation of the one to the other by the study of a definite example, that of memory. It is then frankly dualistic, but on the other hand it deals with the body and mind in such a way as we hope to lessen greatly, if not to overcome, the theoretical difficulties which have always beset dualism, and which cause it, though suggested by the immediate verdict of consciousness and adopted by common sense, to be held in small honor among philosophers. These difficulties are due for the most part to the conception, now realistic, now idealistic, which philosophers have of matter. The aim of our first chapter is to show that realism and idealism both go too far, that it is a mistake to reduce matter to the perception which we have of it, a mistake also to make of it a thing able to produce in us perceptions, but in itself of another nature than they. Matter, in our view, is an aggregate of images, and by image we mean a certain existence, which is more than that which the idealist calls a representation, but less than that which the realist calls a thing. An existence placed halfway between the thing and the representation. This conception of matter is simply that of common sense. It would greatly astonish a man unaware of the speculations of philosophy if we told him that the object before him, which he sees and touches, exists only in his mind and for his mind, or even more generally exists only for mind, as Berkeley held. Such a man would always maintain that the object exists independently of the consciousness which perceives it, but on the other hand, we should astonish him quite as much by telling him that the object is entirely different from that which is perceived in it, that it has neither the color ascribed to it by the eye nor the resistance found in it by the hand. The color, the resistance are for him in the object. They are not states of our mind. They are part and parcel of an existence really independent of our own. For common sense, then, the object exists in itself, and on the other hand, the object is in itself pictorial, as we perceive it. Image it is, but a self-existing image. This is just the sense in which we use the word image in our first chapter. We place ourselves at the point of a mind unaware of the disputes between philosophers. Such a mind would naturally believe that matter exists just as it is perceived, and since it is perceived as an image, the mind would make of it in itself an image. In a word, we consider matter before the dissociation with idealism and realism have brought about between its existence and its appearance. No doubt it has become difficult to avoid this dissociation now that philosophers have made it. To forget it, however, is what we ask of the reader. If in the course of this first chapter objections arise in his mind against any of the views that we put forward, let him ask himself whether these objections do not imply his return to one or the other of the 2 points of view above, which we urge him to rise. Okay, so Couple of things. So, what he's calling realism, so realism and idealism, empiricism and rationalism, they're not the same, but he's using realism in a kind of empiricist kind of sense. Philosophy made a great step forward on the day when Berkeley proved, as against the mechanical philosophers, that the secondary qualities of matter have at least as much reality as the primary qualities. His mistake lay in believing that for this it was necessary to place matter within the mind and make it into a pure idea. Descartes, no doubt, had put matter too far from us when he made it in one of geometrical extensity. But in order to bring it nearer to us, there was no need to go to the point of making it one with our own mind. Because he did not go as far as this, Berkeley was unable to account for the success of physics. And whereas Descartes had set up the mathematical relations between phenomena as their very essence, he was obliged to regard the mathematical order of the universe as a mere accident. So the Kantian criticism became necessary to show the reason of this mathematical order and to give back to our physics a solid foundation, a task in which, however, it succeeded only by limiting the range and value of our senses and of our understanding. The criticism of Kant on this point, at least, would have been unnecessary. The human mind in this direction, at least, would not have been led to limit its own range. Metaphysics would not have been sacrificed to physics if philosophy had been content to leave matter halfway between the place to which Descartes had driven it and that to which Berkeley drew it back. To leave it, in fact, where it is seen by common sense. There we shall try to see it ourselves. Okay, so he is in some ways reproducing the Kantian overcoming of empiricism and rationalism, and also between idealism and realism. But then he's saying he wants to do it this other way. And one thing that Matthias brought up during the break is how phenomenological it is. Right, so this would appear to foreshadow Husserl, Heidegger, and phenomenology more generally in the 20th century. And it does. Right? So there is a general direction in which Kant is retraced phenomenologically. Now, Hegel's not here. Hegel's not here. Whether that matters or not, who knows? But Hegel's not here. All right, so it's happening at the same time as Neo-Kantianism. It's in dialogue with Kant. It's in dialogue with the older philosophical tradition. It's contemporaneous and also in dialogue with Neo-Kantianism. So it seems like a kind of back to Kant moment is happening. And we should think about what the significance of that is. Right, so he says something very similar to Benjamin in the Program of the Coming Philosophy, which is that Kant overcame the difficulty but by limiting things too much. Right, and that what seemed to be missing was the sort of content of experience itself. All right. That being the case, okay. Let me pull up the notes that you guys. Oops, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, it's not my class. It's just, we actually had that question once last time. Says that we don't know if we have to post our questions every class or just the ones that are doing the readings each class.
That you want to. Yeah, post notes as you'd like, absolutely. So everyone is encouraged to, but not required to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, required will be the notes that I have yet to receive.
Oh, they're not on there.
Let me see. Maybe they do. question. Ah,
Oh,
here we
there
go.
it is, yeah.
All right. And then we go to the document. Okay. Okay. So maybe I'll turn to you guys then, Rose and Matthias. How do you want to get us into this?
Sure.
Yeah. Matthias did more of the Bergson and I did the Proust.
Okay, so maybe, so is this Proust stuff yours, Rose?
Yeah.
And then you posted both your notes? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what else did you guys want to talk about the Bergson before we get into the venue? Or should we return to it as needed?
Probably as needed. I don't think I have any terribly incredible insights.
Okay. More questions? Okay, so, oh, I see. Rose, you posted on the actual Proust, like the actual text. Let me know
Oh,
about that.
yeah,
Let me-
Matthias turned in my notes too, because I can't access the discussion board.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Let me bring up. Okay, so we've got one. And then we've got. Okay, we've got the overture, and then we've got the. Okay. Do you guys have notes on the Benjamin on the Proust?
I don't think so.
Oh, no.
No? Nothing on the Benjamin? Oh my goodness, all right.
There was a lot.
Huh?
There was the Bergson and the Proust were a lot.
It was, that's true. It was, and so it was, perhaps, consuming. All right, so let's talk about maybe where we left off when we were reading Benjamin earlier in the class, namely voluntary and involuntary memory. Voluntary and involuntary memory. All right, so the relationship between these two categories. So, and he begins and ends. Someone posted this. Maybe. Yes. Yeah. Maybe. Observation 2. You want to take us through with that?
Yeah. Okay. So for me, one of the trickiest parts when reading Benjamin through the prism of Bergson, after reading Bergson, was this idea of continuity or discontinuity of memory perception. And how it contracts and expands constantly every time we activate it. Exactly like a fan. This metaphor that we had before. So for me, it was interesting to think about the way we approach generally writing any text which is unavoidably linear, but when we try to maintain this pulsation of involuntary or voluntary activated memories, it becomes fragmented, and fragmented is particularly what Bergson was saying that memory isn't. He insisted that it is still like in flux, and that it's not a puzzle that is assembled. So for me, this was kind of like the challenge that we are all facing in this moment of writing any storyline. And particularly, this iconic episode from Proust with Madeleine Yeah,
Right.
is it like a trigger
Right.
that shows, demonstrates, illustrates this activation, this this moment of expansion of memory. Yeah, and in our practice, artworks, symbols are also these triggers that. So probably we are not like what the word that was flying around in this text was trigger.
Mhm.
Yeah, but it was never pronounced
Mhm.
clearly. Yeah, what triggers and what doesn't trigger us, and because is it when we talk about something as triggering, it is still so embodied in our previous experience, yeah, and it is so involuntary for us to be triggered by something, by this smell, by this taste
Mhm.
or view, that this so we still have very concrete object that limits our freedom. Yeah.
What is that?
Huh?
What's that?
I mean, our freedom to react or not to react. I mean, yeah. And it was also interesting to see how we implement, this in our writing, in our text, about history. Can we talk about all the triggers? Can we not? And then should we be aware of them, or like it's impossible to bear all of them in mind?
Right. So okay. So let's talk about that in terms of the voluntary and involuntary memory, the Madeleine. Right. So on the one hand, it's a kind of an activity, and it's also kind of like it's like a ritual, right? So it's like a tea drinking ritual that then prompts a memory. If we use a more neutral term rather than trigger, because trigger is like I don't know, a gun going off or a bomb going off, right? So would overwhelm one. It's more like prompted or activated, right? So how memory that has more of a latent character is activated, right? So it's there, but it's not already in action, but then it's activated, and so. Right, habit memory and pure memory. Right, habit memory is memory that we're already using, and pure memory is the memory that we're not already using, but that we might be able to use. Right. So. Certainly where we're heading in the course, towards the end of the course, like on the concept of history. So what Benjamin calls historicism there, anything that's an ism is a reification, just as a rule of thumb. Anything that ends with a Y is a metaphysical object that is usually the function of some kind of activity. And anything that's an ism is its reification. So history and historicism are opposites. Historicism is the reification of history. So what he calls historicism, and then Nietzsche we'll see has a critique of historicism without necessarily calling it historicism, but describing it nonetheless, is trying to remember the past as it actually was. And so the point is to not do that, right? Because what that does is try to, although we're inevitably driven to do this, but it tries to, and then he diagnoses why we might try to do this, sort of isolate the past moment from what comes after. Right, so every act of remembering is an act of forgetting. So that means that memory and forgetting are inseparable. So again, forgetting is doing something. It's not failing to do something. It's doing something. It's foregoing. It's letting go. And remembering is not, you know, kind of passive effect of memory, but it's an action. So the question is the involuntary action, right? So there's some action of the past has inscribed itself, and however latently, and then it's reactivated. So when it's activated, it's actually something being reactivated. Okay, so history should be more about that, right? Rather than either a kind of linear continuity or trying to isolate something as separate from the flow. So what you're talking about in terms of the fragmentation, that on the one hand it appears fragmented, on the other hand that's exactly what it can't be. Now again, what Bergson is trying to do, the problem he's setting out, is exactly that contradiction, which is that it's not fragmented, but it appears fragmented. So it is not, but appears.
Contact is just related, like fragmentally. Yeah, we touch on a part, yeah, of this memory or image.
Right. So, and similarly, but I think that for Benjamin, Proust is more direct about it and honest about it, which is that Proust is, you know, by writing, like, so it's not philosophy. He's actually doing something in writing that he's sort of highlighting this problem, right? Rather than just having it be a kind of philosophical paradox, and then trying to give an account of what things really are that would overcome it. Rather, it's much more subjective in that respect, and much more kind of committed to its action, to his actual experience. So the appeal, if we put it in these terms, like when we're thinking about like why Proust might have been popular, what is it that people were trying to do or accomplishing? If we look at it almost as like a Freudian symptom, like reading Proust, why is it appealing to people? What's appealing about reading Proust? Symptomatically or pathologically, what is it that one likes about Proust in terms of what Proust is trying to do and what oneself would desire to do, right? Even if it can't be accomplished, the desire to accomplish it is still attractive. It's still appealing in some way, right? So the fact that Proust is constantly revising himself, right? That he's constantly revising his past. But on the one hand, he's trying to capture this unfulfilled potential of the past. On the other hand, he's constantly revising it. And that's why one of the first things that Benjamin addresses is how Proust is constantly rewriting. So he's writing and he's rewriting. And just when he's sending it to press, he's telling the publisher, nope, stop the presses. I've got this change. And then he submits something that's pretty much indecipherable in terms of how it should be changed. Right. Now that's the backstory, right? But something of the spirit of that comes through the actual text. Right. So memory seems to be taking the place of life. So where Bergson identifies memory and life, Proust seems to be highlighting the difference. Right, and so what we can see is that Bergson is trying to kind of overcome something that nonetheless we haven't overcome. And, you know, kind of can't overcome just by thinking about it a different way. So that would be, by the way, my riposte to the Deleuzians. What do they like about Bergson? They like this idea that he's overcome something philosophically, and that's attractive to them. Whereas the point would be, not only wouldn't we like to overcome this problem, but also why we can't overcome this problem. meaning what it offers is a kind of philosophical satisfaction that can't be had philosophically. Capitalism can't be solved philosophically. Right? In other words, if we're sitting with Benjamin here, for Benjamin, what's important is that the philosophical problem is like a real social historical problem. So what appears to be a problem in the way we think about things is actually capitalism. Right? And we're not going to solve capitalism by thinking about it a different way.
Just like creating a busy box for yourself.
Right. Yeah. Right, exactly. It would be a kind of, so philosophy would be a kind of neurosis. Yeah. Oh, for sure. Freud thought so. It's called epistemophilia. Right? It's trying to correct your life by knowing. By knowing. No, that's an illusion. And it's a symptom. So, what's interesting for Benjamin is what Proust sort of does, what he performs, right? The symptomology that he is actually enacting. Which he thinks that we can learn from rather than simply enjoy, right? So there's a kind of a pathos, there's a suffering to Proust that could be suppressed in enjoying it as literature, right? So whereas really it's the pain of Proust that needs to be keyed into. And the pathos of, okay, I can't live my life in reality, but I can live it somehow in memory. I can live it in retrospect. Very peculiar. And maybe very new and modern as a phenomenon.
So is, if we're gonna extend this into like pretty rough like abstractions, it's Proust's problem is that he can't forget, or he's melancholic because he can't live life, he can't get new libidinal objects, and Benjamin is perhaps interested because he sees a problem in modernity as an inability to forget, and that's producing this character of melancholy.
Very good, yes, that's exactly it. Because I was going to say, the goal is to forget. The goal is to forget. When we get to Kafka, we'll read Josephine the Singer or the Mouseful, where redemption is forgetting. Redemption is forgetting. I mean, the goal is to forget.
Wouldn't he still, like what Jack was saying with Jack, wouldn't he still like not be able to find new objects? Like even if he forgot, right? He said the point is forgetting, but if he forgot, like that doesn't mean that he would necessarily have interest in new objects.
That's right. Well, right. There would be a kind of false forgetting and a true forgetting. There's a Nietzsche phrase that springs to mind. Goodreads. Sorry, children. As soon as it becomes possible by dint of a strong will to overthrow the entire past of the world, then in a single moment we will join the ranks of independent gods. World history for us will then be nothing but a dreamlike otherworldly being. The curtain falls and man once more finds himself a child playing with whole worlds. A child awoken by the first glow of morning who laughingly wipes the frightful dreams from his brow. That's the goal.
Yeah, and Proust, when he wakes up, seems to find it very upsetting.
Yes. In other words, he wakes up upset. Yeah.
His
He's
mom
kind
will
of,
give him a kiss.
yeah, he's not comforted by sleep. He's an insomniac too. He's an insomniac. How come it doesn't give us the source?
You need it.
Huh? I guess we can find the source. I guess Grok or whoever. What is Google's AI mode? Is it from the Will to Power, or is it from? I think it might also be.
You can just go to the
Which?
rules.
Oh, you mean that's true too. Although Google Books doesn't work so well.
Wow.
See what I mean? Google Books should be like awesome, but it's never quite. Never quite. This is not, I don't think this is from a war reading by Nietzsche, but it's going to come up. It's going to come up in the Arcades project. What we're reading is The Use and Abuse of History for Life. It would be great if it were there, but no, I think it's in The Will to Power. I just want to double check that. Anyway. So yeah. Well, so going back to Freud from last time, why would insomnia be a symptom of melancholy? Because melancholy is precisely the inability to withdraw the libido back into the self, right? To kind of have that narcissistic pleasure of withdrawing libido from objects, right? So mourning is the painful process of withdrawing libido back into the self, and that's exactly what the melancholic can't do, right? That because the melancholic can't go through the process of mourning, can't let go of the objects, then it would interfere with the kind of narcissistic pleasure of something like sleep. Right, because that kind of normal activity of the psyche is not available to the melancholic. And by the way, that's why it's a much more basic kind of impairment than neurosis. That's why melancholia leans more over into psychosis than neurosis.
You said something earlier that seemed like a really important thesis that I feel like I'm really not grasping, and it was essentially that in reification phenomenally is experienced as time becoming an image. Can you expand on that, maybe in reference to Proust and Benjamin?
Okay, so yes, so there's sort of thick description in Proust. Right, so, there's detailed description of images, and especially like of places, but also of people. And I want to say the obsessive focus on people's faces, the physiognomies of people, is this weird, like, expression of the prevailing kind of biological racism that's emerging at the end of the 19th century. So the physiognomies is something that we're going to talk about when we get to the Arcades project. There were these little books that showed like different profiles of people, and you carried the book around, and then like if you were interacting with someone, you'd be like, and then you'd like know the personality of the person you're dealing with based on the shape of their faces.
I saw something like that actually. I was at an antique store and I found a book of that, and I flipped to a random page, and it was how to tell a loving husband from a deceitful husband. And it was like a loving husband has a tiny head, but a deceitful husband has a very large head.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So Matt Gates. Matt Gates has a big head now. Very bizarre looking guy.
Like study of like the head.
Phrenology, yeah. But let's keep it on physiognomy, because phrenology is more like skulls and brains, and bumps, and whereas physiognomy is more like the face. And so in the faces, he would do these. Proust does these like intense descriptions of people's faces, where you can read their ancestry through their faces, right? And it's about the aristocratic lineage of people and how they're tied to the places that they're from, and the sort of deep history. And of course, Jews don't fit that, right? So it's these are Germanic, like the aristocrats are Germanic, sometimes Gallo-Roman, meaning some hybrid of Roman and Celtic, or but an Aryan, meaning Germanic, the Germanic tribes, and their different features. But Jews don't fit into that, right? So Jews are not part of that physiognomic universe, right? So that's the other kind of weird pathos. And that not only he does this, but other people do this. In other words, that every present-day nobility person is literally embodying their family history. Like, that's what their bodies are. They are embodied history. Right, so they are literally, it's in their blood, right? And that this is the way that class was experienced in the 19th century, something that we'll get into again when we get more into the Arcades project. We're kind of introducing these themes here, which is that the working class was racialized. Like, meaning the idea was that the upper class was more like Frankish, more Germanic, and the lower classes was more Gallic, Celtic. So it's literally like that. Class was racialized, which also happened elsewhere, also in the United States, but seemingly having more to do with actual, anthropological, biological race, but maybe just a variety of the same. So anti-Semitism, of course, is part of the subtext here, which is, Swann, right? So how does he fit into this world? And how should he relate to people? And, again, where does he fit into this history? Not only this present world, but its history, because there is a kind of joining of the aristocracy through the plutocracy, through money. Did you guys watch Downton Abbey? A little bit, Downton Abbey. So Downton Abbey is about this, it's kind of telescoped and compressed type kind of time span, but it's about this bourgeoisification of the nobility and ennoblement of the bourgeoisie. And so it's about like the old aristocrats are like finding it impossible to afford to keep up their manorial estates, and so they're selling it, and they're selling the land piecemeal out from under the farmers, but then they're also marrying into wealthy families to get like money to prop up the estate, and yeah, the manors are being bought by rich people, right? And then there is this question of anti-Semitism, meaning the Jews are rich enough to buy castles. Is there something wrong with that, right? There's something sort of inherently wrong with that. And also intermarriage and this kind of thing, right? Is it acceptable from either perspective, from either side, from the Gentile side or from the Jewish side? And so, but it's about like how class, socioeconomic class, doesn't quite fit aristocratic caste. So it's very Proustian in this sense. And we should think about why we would still be fascinated by these kinds of stories. Like, in other words, why was Downton Abbey made in the 21st century? Right?
The new movie just came out, right?
Yeah, and there's going to be yet another movie. I thought that they finished it, but then I'm watching the other series that's a spin-off, which is The Gilded Age, which is about old money, new money. And it's not as good as Downton Abbey. It's not, but it's of interest. It's interesting. And it's also...
It's exactly what's going on now, too, with like the uber-rich. I mean, it's just a reflection of current. And people are here now are like...
It is.
Left with the wealthy and the super wealthy. And
It is.
It's just the same, but they're in costume.
Right. I mean, we're living in another like Gilded Age type scenario, definitely. So, the question is, where is it?
And
leading?
Downton Abbey, I think, could be...
Downton Abbey, because I think World War I is the definitive experience within the Downton Abbey storyline too. It's like when everything kind of hits home and changes. Gilded Age is not going to have that because it's like before. It's not going to take it all the way up to that period. But anyway, so the fact that the past is present in this way, right? It's present in people's bodies. It's not only present in architecture and furniture and whatnot, but it's present in people's bodies. And how that suggests possibilities, but also suggests inherent limitations. Right, so it's a kind of, there's a, the childhood that's remembered, were there really these possibilities, or maybe not? Mm-hmm.
I was curious, are they considering childhood as a separate external part of their life? Like, because, you know, we're talking about the series of experiences that are all collapsed into each other,
Mm-hmm.
but also with modernity and, you know, capitalism, like the role of the child changes around this time, and I'm curious, are they like building up childhood by writing from their adult reflection, like adding value to their childhood thoughts by looking back on it?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, certainly. Meaning this is not like necessarily an accurate. I mean, Benjamin is a lot more critical about reflecting on that than Proust is, but Proust, there is a kind of clearly projected character into the past, right? So it's not about the innocence of childhood, but it is about understanding like the passage of time as somehow the exhaustion of possibilities, even while there's a desire to sort of restore those possibilities, right? So it is, maybe we could think of it that way, that we could think of like childhood as being defined as more unlimited possibilities. It's very much in keeping with the experience piece that we read by Benjamin from 1913, right? Which is that, what the older person resents about the younger person is that they still have possibilities. And so the message of the adult to the youth is, you're going to grow up. You're going to experience the disappointment. You're going to experience the squandering of potential. And therefore, it's already wasted. It's already gone. Right? And Benjamin's like, no, it's not gone yet. And I'm going to be forever young. Right. The later Benjamin would regard that as symptomatic. Would regard his earlier self as symptomatic. Like, he certainly regards his Nietzscheanism as symptomatic, for sure. And we'll see, he reads Nietzsche as a manic depressive, for sure. So Baudelaire and Nietzsche are both manic depressives. Like, that's the whole, like, will to power is like the philosophy of a depressed person, for sure. Definitely, That doesn't make it any less true. It makes it more true, actually, but in a peculiar way. Meaning it can't just be taken at face value. It's to be taken as a symptom. Writing history, let me just say this, because this is something that we'll be talking about, for sure. Like, when we get to On the Concept of History, the issue really is historiography. So not history as a metaphysical object, but historiography, meaning, articulating this relation between the present and the past, actually articulating it, objectifying it. So, as an autobiography, Proust is doing a work of history too. Right, but then it really raises the question of what historiography is. What was it that Proust fought so frenetically? What was at the bottom of these infinite efforts? Can we say that all lives, works, and deeds that matter were never anything but the undisturbed unfolding of the most banal, most fleeting, most sentimental, weakest hour in the life of the one to whom they pertain? When Proust in a well-known passage described the hour that was most his own, he did it in such a way that everyone could find it in his own existence. We might almost call it an everyday hour. It comes with the night, a lost twittering of birds, or a breath drawn at the sill of an open window, and there is no telling what encounters would be in store for us if we were less inclined to give in to sleep. Proust did not give in to sleep, and yet, or rather precisely for this reason, Jean Cocteau was able to say in a beautiful essay that the intonation of Proust's voice obeyed the laws of night and honey. By submitting to these laws, he conquered the hopeless sadness within him. what he called the incurable imperfection that is the essence of the present. And from the honeycombs of memory, he built a house for the swarm of his thoughts. Cocteau recognized that what really should have been the major concern of all readers of Proust, and yet has served no one as the pivotal point of his reflections or his affection. He recognized Proust's blind, senseless, frenzied quest for happiness. It shone from his eyes they were not happy, but in them there lay fortune as it lies in gambling or in love. Nor is it hard to say why this paralyzing, explosive will to happiness which pervades Proust's writings is so seldom comprehended by his readers. In many places, Proust himself made it easy for them to view this oeuvre too from the time-tested, comfortable perspective of resignation, heroism, and asceticism. After all, nothing makes more sense to the model pupils of life than the notion that a great achievement is the fruit of toil, misery, and disappointment. The idea that happiness could have a share in beauty would be too much of a good thing, something that their resentment would never get over. And resentment is a Nietzsche term that we'll talk about. There's a dual will to happiness, a dialectics of happiness, a hymnic and an elegiac form. This is the last thing I want to say before we end. The one is the unheard of, the unprecedented, the height of bliss. The other, the eternal repetition, the eternal restoration of the original, the first happiness. It is this elegiac idea of happiness. It could also be called the Eleatic, which for Proust transforms existence into a preserve of memory. To it he sacrificed in his life friends and companionship, in his works plot, unity, and characters, the flow of the narration, the play of the imagination. Right, so it sort of thematizes boredom, but boredom as a site of happiness. Okay, so I don't want to extend this too far. All right, so next time, Karl Kraus. We'll see. We'll be switching. So we'll be switching from novelistic literature and autobiography to journalism. Journalism, which is we'll see, is both a big shift and maybe not much of a shift with Karl Kraus. Okay, thanks, guys.